A new poll from YouGov exposes the stark partisan divide in how the public understands the nation's crime rate. 3 in 5 U.S. adults believe the country's crime rate has increased either a lot or a little over the past year. When political party is taken into account, 80% of Republicans say the same compared to only 59% of Democrats. Fox News viewers are most likely to believe the worst about crime in the U.S. A whopping 65% said the crime rate has increased, quote, a lot since 2020. The latest insight into the true crime rate is from the FBI's Uniform Crime Report for 2020, where data shows that overall crime is down 6% from 2019, while violent crime is up 5% and homicides are up 30%. Here to discuss is journalist Zaid Jilani. Welcome, Zaid.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
And so I guess there's almost no good answer to the question. If you were polled and said, is crime up or down, I guess the good answer would be, well, what kind of crime are you talking about? What do you make of these kind of competing perceptions of crime in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a good question because when people reference crime or they bring up crime, they're often thinking of all kinds of different things, right? And often it's like local to what their context is or what they're talking about, right? So some people in some cities where local news is covering like shoplifting or like organized crime around theft, they may be thinking about that or referring to that. Or other people may be thinking about Grand Theft Auto or carjackings, and other people are thinking about shootings and homicides. And it certainly is true that what happened last year was actually many categories of crime dropped. Like property type crimes or certain nonviolent crimes dropped. And I think that actually happened around the world. And I think it's pretty obvious why. Last year, many different governments imposed lockdowns or at least encouraged them. A lot of people were staying home. So there's just a lot less crime of that sort in general. In most places, also violent crime dropped. Even in El Salvador, which is like one of the most violent countries in the world, they saw I think one of their lowest homicide rates ever last year, right? Mexico saw a decline in homicides, other places. But in the United States, there were at least two categories of crime that went way up. Actually, it was a historic increase. One of those categories was homicides, so murders, and the other one was shootings, which, obviously U.S. is always somewhat of an outlier in shootings. But the rate of increase was remarkable, I think, in many cases. For homicides in particular, the increase was historic. It was almost 30%. Which most people had sort of calculated by themselves by just taking aggregate data from many cities. But the Uniform Crime Report is supposed to be the gold standard from the FBI. Although it should be noted that the Uniform Crime Report has its own issues, including underreporting of certain things like the hate crime data. People always look at the hate crime data. But the hate crime data is largely based on self-reporting. So whatever communities have the best NGOs and civil society organizations to encourage people to report, tend to dominate those statistics. So some parts of the UCR I wouldn't take at face value, but the thing about something like murders is that it's a very credible crime to generally record across the world because you can't really hide bodies, right? So I think when they record the murder numbers, most people do find those to be credible, and unfortunately it was a significant increase. I think that the increase has tapered off in a few places this year in 2021 so far. Of course, we don't have aggregate data for the entire year. It's like in New York City, I think it's slowing down. It's still increasing, but slowing down. Whereas in other places, like I think Chicago, it's continuing to go up. So it's also, the other thing you have to remember that it's very uneven. If you live in certain neighborhoods in Chicago or St. Louis, you might as well be living in Zurich in Switzerland, right? Like it's just very safe. But certain neighborhoods are as dangerous as living in sketchy parts of Central America. So it's very, very uneven in terms of the distribution of the exposure to things like crime as well, which I think is something we have to understand as we live in a very diverse country, a lot of socioeconomic diversity, cultural diversity, blah, blah, blah. So not everyone's going to experience everything the same way either.
You've tweeted some really interesting sort of analyses of polls recently as well as it relates to defunding the police and the difference between the media narrative and public opinion. And I think you get into that here too as well as you're talking about the regional unevenness. How does the media narrative, how is it informed and shaped by that unevenness? And how does that affect sort of our perception of the country as members of the public?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, if you look at the last arc of 30 or 40 years, particularly local news tends to report a lot of crime. The line is if it bleeds, it leads, right? So I think even when crime was like, even violent crime was declining, like in the late 90s and early 2000s, I think a lot of people kept thinking crime was going up and things were getting more unsafe, which wasn't true at that point. So I think there was almost like an overcorrection in parts of the media to where you had a generation of people, younger people going into media, knowing that media often exaggerates crime, to where I think a lot of those people responded to the last year thinking, oh, it's not that bad. Or you see a lot of minimization, like, oh, it's not as bad as 1990, which is a funny thing to say. You know, it was not as bad as a year when nobody had cell phones and everyone was using fax machines, and like, you know, half these journalists weren't even born yet. So like, you know, there's been, I think that in some sectors of media, there is overcorrection. And I do think that, you know, there's this hesitation to obviously create maybe a hysteria about crime, which I think is justified because, you know, as we said, many people don't really have much exposure to violent crime. But if you live in like St. Louis, they had a 50-year high in their homicide rate last year. Like that's really, really bad. That's like national crisis level bad if it was happening everywhere. If that level of homicide was happening everywhere in the country, it would be like front page news every day, right? And we'd have bills going through Congress on it, blah, blah, blah. But because it's St. Louis, it's a very, you know, low income, marginalized part of a state, part of a country. I don't think you get the same response, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And Zaid, one thing I've heard from criminologists as an explanation to some of the increase in shootings and murders in 2020 has to do with the lockdown, in the sense that there were so many fewer people just out in the streets that confrontations between two people that previously would have been broken up, or among two people that would have broken themselves up because they're in a crowded area, are allowed to fester and go on and ratchet up, and then somebody pulls out a gun eventually, and then somebody pulls the trigger, or several people pull a trigger. What do you make of the role of the lockdowns in the increase in murders? Because I think you're right to point to the role of lockdowns in the reduction of some other crimes, because if, for instance, a CVS is not open, well, CVS has stayed open, but if businesses are not open, you can't shoplift from them, or you can't have crimes committed, you know, related to those businesses.
Yeah, I mean, it's not clear. I don't think there's a strong consensus about the shooting increase. Most of the murders, I think, were related to shootings. It's typically the case in the U.S. because there's more guns than people in the United States. But I don't think there's a strong consensus as to the explanatory variables here. I don't think that the timeline lines up very well to time the lockdowns with the shootings. I think that the lockdowns largely predated the shooting spike. The most credible theories are probably that there was one Professor Castle out of University of Utah who has done a little bit of work on this. He looked at things like proactive policing in the summer of 2020, and he basically saw that police were pulling back in many large cities. They were doing less stops and arrests, and I think that opened up a lot of space for people who, you know, unfortunately were career criminals, and to open up cycles of violence. It's not clear, though, exactly what's happening now. Like, I don't think anyone's collected more recent data either on policing or on just people's behavior. Like, how much have they changed their behavior now that the pandemic has receded a little bit? So it's not super clear to me, like, why there's a continued increase in places like Chicago, or a persistent increase in places like Austin or Portland or St. Louis. It may very well have been that there have been a combination of factors that were quite unique in summer of 2020 that really surges at the beginning. Why it's ongoing, I think, you know, it's an extremely complicated question. But I think we do know and we do understand that, generally speaking, when you have, and this is Roland Fryers, the Harvard economist who did this study, when you have a high-profile like police incident, suspected police abuse incident, and then you have like a pattern or practice investigation where those departments come under investigations, police often respond by cutting their policing down to very low levels. Like, I think in Chicago, he found that like went almost to zero or something after their incident and after their investigations, which is a very blunt response, right? Like, you'd want police accountability, you want them to change their behavior when there's abuses, but you don't really want like a blunt response where like police are just pulling back altogether. I think they're still responding to 911 calls, but it's like, you know, if you drive by and you see a couple guys in a fight, you're like, I probably shouldn't intervene in that. Someone might have a camera and it'll look bad. And like, you know, it sounds kind of silly, but that was happening all over the country. And, you know, the question is like, how can you have that accountability and the reduction of abuses, but not see like the blanket cutting back in policing? Because that does open up a lot of spaces for violence. I mean, that's what happened in Baltimore. Baltimore did not see a huge increase in murders last year. And the reason why is pretty simple to me. They saw that increase after 2015, after Freddie Gray. They saw almost 50% murder increase, and they've stayed at that level since. They have like a new normal. But they didn't really see an increase last year probably because the depolicing already happened. The police, they're already kind of backed off. The media leaves them alone now because they're not, there's no more Freddie Gray incidents, but tons more people are dead, which media doesn't really care about. So it's kind of a win-win for people who didn't want very much policing in Baltimore, but unfortunately, there's been a lot of death. And I think we have to be able to find that middle ground, right, where we can address legitimate abuses, legitimate unconstitutional practices that were occurring even in Baltimore, which was found by the Obama administration, but also understand that it doesn't mean go 180 in the other direction and just stop doing your jobs. If any other sector of the economy stopped doing their jobs, we would see disaster. And I think the same thing happens with policing, unfortunately.
Right. And all of the incentives are for critics to stay quiet and to de-amplify their voices. Zaid Jilani, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. We'll be back with more Rising right after this.